Hello, kind people. More Altibox Norway chess content coming your way. I'm Peter Svidler, and I'm doing this video after the conclusion of round 7 of the tournament in Stavanger. And in round 7 we had a great number of very interesting games. As usual, some very exciting Armageddons. But as opposed to the previous couple of videos, today's featured game of the day will not feature, nice sentence there, Peter, will not feature the world champion Magnus Carlsen. We will be looking at the game played by Liren with the white pieces against Shakhriyar Mamedyarov playing black. So let's have a look at the game. And the usual scooching to the right commences. Liren with white plays almost exclusively 1d4, although some 1c4 has been seen on occasion. And Shach these days seems to be sticking to his Grunfelds, and the same happened today once again. Ding's main weapon against the Grunfeld these days is very much the sharpest move on the books here, 3 of 3. Giving black a chance to switch to Benoni structures after, let's say, c5, d5, e6. Black can choose to make all kinds of random looking moves. In my recent game against Ding late last year, I played knight c6, and that did not go well, particularly for me. But of course, the main move after 3 always has been and remains d7, d5. Sticking to the Grunfeld spirit, so to speak, although the positions that result from this are very varied and not very Grunfeld-like, I think, as un-Grunfeld-like as you can get. White takes, goes e4, knight c3, bishop g7, bishop c3, castles, queen d2. And this is a very important fork in the road here. Magnus, in his Armageddon game against Wesley So, played also today. Played knight c6, castles long, and f5, e5, f4, which is a very, very fresh approach, pioneered, among others, by that promising young chess player called AlphaZero. After long castles, of course, black can still play queen d6. I don't believe this line has been refuted, and this is what I recommended in my Grunfeld video series. But Shach goes for the line that never really went away, but is kind of I feel less popular than the other two, which is e5, d5, and c6. A very, very direct approach. Black aims to immediately sort of destroy the white pawn center and create files for counterplay. And since by playing 3 of 3, white sort of commits to castling queenside in most cases, white also needs to start opening some files on the king side here for his future play, which is why you play h4. If you castle first, black will be, for instance, in time to bring the knight over to f6, and it will be a lot harder for white to open anything up on the king side, which is why it's important to start with h4. Takes, takes, knight d7, h5, knight f6. White gets to insert hg, fg, and only now white castles queenside. Bishop d7, king b1, rook c8, and d6. I'm showing you these moves at this very, very high speed because this is sort of by far the most important position of the entire line, and there's a great deal of theory here and a great deal of very strong grandmaster practice even. And the move that Shach played today, e5, e4, is by far the most important and the most central in this position. This is a very typical idea. Black wants to free up this bishop and as soon as possible include it in his counterplay. White used to try to ignore this pawn. There's some theory connected with the move bishop h6, after which another very typical idea for black, knight a4, seems to completely equalize. After, let's say, knight d5, takes, takes, king h8, bishop g7, king g7. There are some forced draws available, including, for instance, a game that was played between Ding himself with white against Boris Gelfand, in which Ding took on e4 and had to give a perpetual in this position because black's counterplay on the king side is just way too strong. And there are some other games, for instance, in the Baku World Cup, Hismaturin tried not giving the same perpetual, and eventually even lost this position to Areshenko, although I don't think it's already worse here. There's also a strange looking move king a1, which is actually quite typical for these types of positions, because the king is safer on a1 than it is on b1. It doesn't immediately become obvious why, but you dodge potentially some checks in the future from the f5 square, and you kind of get away as far away as possible from potential exchange sacrifices on c3, and then some counterplay sometimes occurs along the b file. And after king a1, play is also very, very sharp. For instance, Timur Rajabov played this with white against Liren Dominguez, and was at some point, according to the machine, much better in the following complications. But obviously, people have been analyzing this since, and probably came to conclusions on how to deal with king a1. fe4 is currently the most central way of asking questions for white here. Shach plays knight g4 quite quickly, bishop g5, queen e8, knight f3. This is seemingly a very, very random position, which nonetheless has seen a lot of very relevant grandmaster practice, and was, I think, until today considered to be reasonably safe for black, despite being an almighty mess. Rook f7 is the main move in this position. It's not easy to explain why you have to include rook f7, but people have concluded that you do have to. And the very early game from this line between Maxim Rothstein and David Navarra in the European Club Cup in 2012 went rook c3, bc, queen e4, bishop d3, queen c6, bishop c2. And white is actually better here, because the bishop gets often transferred over to b3, and that stops a lot of black's potential attacking ideas on the queen side. And white is, after all, an exchange up right now. So black makes this waiting move rook f7, perhaps intending to play knight a4 later, and generally just waiting for a move and asking white, what do you want to play? The most obvious move in the position, of course, is bishop e7, but it has been proven that rook c3 and queen c8 just makes a draw here after rook c1, knight a4, knight g5, and here simply queen c5. The first game from this position was played between Liren Dominguez once again with the black pieces, playing against Alexander Grishuk in a FIDE World Cup in 2013, and that game went knight takes f7, knight c3, rook c3, bishop c3, and it turns out that there's really not much going on the king side for white. He goes knight h6 check. Of course, you don't take, allowing to trade queens. You play king g7, and then black has a perpetual on the queen side. There has been a funny game since played in the same line between the two promising Iranian youngsters, Tabatabai versus Maksudlu, in which in this position Tabatabai played rook h3, and they played a very long, seemingly very, very forced, sort of from start to finish game, starting from this position, and this position turns out also to be quite level. Which is why after rook f7, white switched to trying different ideas. Radek Wojtaszek played rook e1 here against Dominguez in Tromsø 2014. And they got to this very weird looking position, in which the computer suggests that white might be slightly better, but once again I'm pretty sure that rook e1 is no longer a novelty and people know how to react to it. So attention has been moved to the move queen e1, which is what Ding Liren plays today against Shach. Black goes rook c5. Once again, I'm not entirely sure why this move is so necessary. I assume it's with the intention of maybe playing queen c8 in some positions. But if I tried to give you a complete overview of all the options black has in this position, this video would really never ever end. And I want to insert a disclaimer somewhere around here that what you will see from somewhere around this position is a very, very preliminary analysis. I haven't spent too much time on it. I aimed to give you some kind of an overview of people's options here, but there is no way I could exhaust this position properly in the time frame available. So rook c5 we will just accept without comment because this is still the move which saw 2 games. So it's the main line, and Shach played it reasonably quickly, which makes you think that he probably knew this is what you're supposed to play here. And Ding replied by quickly playing bishop d2, which is the first absolutely new move of the game. In 2 games, White played bishop e7. Daniel Vakatura played this against Wagner in 2016. And more recently, this was played by Tal Baron against Globus in 2018. And White won both of those games, despite the position remaining quite unclear, frankly. I'm not exactly sure what is so wrong about bishop e7. But bishop d2 is a new take on this whole position, obviously aiming to put a hard stop on Black's potential counterplay connected with rook takes c3, or even bishop takes c3. Shach played bishop e6, which is probably the best move in the position. I tried figuring out what White wants to do here, and he probably wants to do something like bishop d3, c2, b3 if allowed, and just bishop d3 in general is a move that the computer quite likes here. In order to stop that, you can either play bishop e6 or you can play rook c6, obviously intending to just take on d6 if the bishop comes to d3. After rook c6, knight g5 is a bit too early because knight f2 is a good reply. But after bishop e2, the position remains a huge mess. Now you cannot at all take on d6 because knight g5 apparently more or less completely wins. But you can play something like h5. And I left the machine running here. It says bishop c1 is a move you can make, already quite bizarre, having played bishop d2 earlier. Also, you can play knight g5, and the evaluation remains sort of within the margins. White is somewhat better, but my best guess is that Black holds this. But bishop e6 is quite logical, improving the position of this bishop. Now, basically, most of Black's pieces are kind of activated to create counterplay on the king side, sorry, on the queen side. But this didn't come as a surprise to Ding, who blitzes out e4, e5, which indeed is what the machine suggests you should do here. And this was very much a turning point in the game, because Shach replied by a move which is not horrible, but as we know from recent TV classics, not great either. The machine suggests that you should play knight a4 straight away. This was sort of your intention when you were playing bishop e6, and you should stick to it. White now probably goes knight e4. It's possible to go bishop d3, but after bishop d3, a very weird position arises on the board, in which the computer actually quite quickly starts suggesting to, in some order, take on e5 and then just take on b2. Even immediately knight b2, king b2, knight e5 is not completely pointless. But it says that starting with knight e5, waiting until White goes rook h4 here, attacking the knight on a4, and just playing something along these lines is stronger. And I think looking at this position, you can see why this is quite playable for Black. The king on b2 is extremely weak, and Black has all of his pieces participating in potential attacks, so White will have to probably return some material here, maybe even quite a lot of material, to diffuse the very, very strong initiative Black has. And also, very importantly, White really has no pressure on the other side of the board. The entire focus of the game has been switched to White defending on the queen side. Which is why I think knight e4 is a better try. Black replies by playing bishop f5. White needs to immediately unpin himself, because if he doesn't play king e1, he is immediately worse. And in this position, somewhat surprisingly, you are supposed to play rook c5, c8. No active moves work properly for Black for various reasons. I did not get too much into the question why exactly, but the machine is very, very adamant that you're supposed to play rook c8 here, and that... Sorry, bishop f5, not king e1 first, bishop c1 first. My apologies. Stopping once again the potential attacks against the b2 square, and generally preparing to unpin yourself. But looking at this position now, I know that the machine says you absolutely have to play rook c8, but it would be difficult for me to explain to you without computer assistance, for instance, why you cannot take on e5 here. It seems perfectly reasonable to make this move, but the machine dislikes it quite severely for its own machine reasons, which we probably shouldn't be getting too much into. So machine goes rook c8. Here, once again, bishop d3 is already a mistake, because after knight takes e5, black is doing very well. So here white finally unpins himself with king a1. And black is, unfortunately, cannot take with the knight here, because knight eg5 is very strong, and white is just in time to create threats of his own, which stop black's potential counterplay on the other side of the board. And once again, I don't think it's possible to appreciate just how bad this position is just by looking at it without computer analysis, but the computer suggests this is close to winning for white. And it takes on e5 with the bishop, obviously immediately creating the idea of rook c1, bishop b2, to which white replies by taking and playing knight c3. You need to stop those ideas in their tracks. Black goes on knight e5, queen e5, knight e5, b takes c3, and h5. And it still prefers white, but I suspect in practical play black is not even particularly worse, because he has his own trumps going on the queen or on the king side. The pawn will be reasonably well blocked, for instance, by this knight, if black wants to. And there are enough targets for black to create counterplay against that I think he should not lose this position if he plays well. But obviously knight a4 is an incredible mess, and seems like e5 had thrown Shah quite a bit, because he spent quite a bit of time here and took on e5 with the bishop. And now black's position, according to the machine, becomes quite critical. Bishop d3 is the best move. Once again, you just need to start bringing your own pieces into play. And in some cases, the option of taking on g6, not immediately, but in some kind of future, will become quite dangerous for white. Sorry, for black. And this is basically where the game was, where it went all completely off the rails for Shah. Having taken on e5 with the bishop, I think it's understandable that he didn't want to go back to g7 straight away, but this is what the computer suggests you should do. Either this or knight c4, which is a reasonably logical move as well, but some positions like this, in which white cannot take on e5 straight away because he loses the queen, but he can play something like bishop g5. They're still playable for black, but the white king will eventually feel quite safe on a1, and the black king, with all the dark squares still quite weak around him, is quite vulnerable, and the machine suggests this is better for white. But both bishop g7 here and knight c4 were a lot stronger than the move that Shakhriyar made. He played knight a4, to which Ding quite simply replied knight takes e5. If you take with the knight, the very simple move bishop c2 is extremely strong. Black is more or less forced to take on c3 or to move back, and if you take on c3, you immediately, like one look at this position should be enough for anyone to convince himself that black is probably lost, because this bishop is incredibly strong, the king is now safe, and black doesn't even have any extra material to show for it. Therefore, Ding took with the rook, and here, arguably, Ding committed his one slight inaccuracy of the game. After queen g3, black is more or less completely doomed, because he really does not have any useful way to continue. White just wants to play rook he1 next move. And if you play knight f2, hoping to maybe catch white with some cheapos, a very simple shot of bishop takes g6 just ends the game on the spot. Black can resign here. And after queen g3, Surprisingly to me, white doesn't have any direct threats that kind of win the game by winning a lot of material. He just goes rook he1 more or less after any move and says this is completely hopeless for black simply because his pieces are discoordinated, and once white gets all the things under control, trades one pair of rooks, perhaps plays bishop c2 next, driving the knight from a4, he will just completely run over the black position with the strength of his bishops and the passer on d6. Instead, Ding played queen h4, rook h5, queen g3. And here you can understand why Shah was looking for some forcing solutions, but he had to kind of bite the bullet and play rook h1, and start returning his pieces to the defense, playing knight c5 here. Once again, after knight f2 instead of knight c5, both rook e1 and the more romantic solution of taking on g6, taking on f7, sorry, and just picking up the knight on a4 is quite strong for white. But after knight c5, let's say bishop c2, queen f8, intending to play rook f1 next move, or maybe slightly better for white is the option of playing rook e1, takes, and now a very important and probably the only move in the position, queen c8, because it's very, very important for black to challenge the queen on d4 immediately by playing queen c4. If you allow white to settle with queen on d4 and not trade it, white will of course win because he will create too many threats on the dark squares. But after queen d4, queen c4, black is still very much alive, even though the computer prefers white quite seriously in this endgame. Shah instead decided he needs to create direct counterplay and played knight c3, bishop c3, queen a4, and this just loses. And during the live show, I was very proud when I spotted the move that Ding played in this position, and I had a suspicion it was quite strong. But the computer, somewhat funnily, says this is absolutely pointless, it creates no threats, and you can just play a2, a3, and black can more or less resign. Because I will play bishop c2 next, says the computer, and then I will start calmly destroying the black position by trading on h5 or pushing the d-pawn or creating threats along the long diagonal, and there's just no counterplay. So a3 perhaps is an even stronger practical decision than the move Ding made, but Ding's move is a lot more aesthetically pleasing. He played d7, seemingly giving up on his one most important trump, and also giving up the pawn on a2 with check. But you can't really take on a2, it's only one check you can give here after queen a1. In this position, even king d2 is immediately winning, attacking the queen and also continuing to threaten d7. And of course you cannot take on d7 with the rook because queen b8 check wins, or with the queen because after takes. I mean, bishop takes h7 is quite easily technically winning for white, but the computer suggests that just playing bishop c2 and then slowly but surely getting the queen over to some kind of a square like d4 or g5 or anywhere is just completely hopeless for black because of just how incredibly strong these two bishops are. But Shah did not blunder d7. He felt this actually gave him a good shot by playing rook d5. And suddenly the d-pawn is stopped. Obviously bishop takes g6, rook d1 is not great. The same applies to a very nice shot which would have won on the spot, rook h7, with the intention of rook h7, queen b8. But unfortunately, of course, after rook h7, queen takes d1 is made in one move. So seemingly black has things under control for a moment, but bishop c2, which Ding calmly played in this position, just wins. If you take on d1 and on a2, the position crumbles because after king c1, queen a1 check and bishop b1, the checks run out. And despite white even losing the d7 pawn, his attack is just way too strong. Takes, queen c7, and the fact that the queen is in the corner and not participating in the defense just decides everything in this game. For instance, after queen a4, white has a very aesthetically pleasing mate in 6 by going bishop a2 check, and then doing this little bit of a ladder climbing. Because of that, Shah took on d7, and now white just plays bishop b3 very quietly. and black's position collapses because you're forced to trade the rooks along the d file. If you don't, and if you give white this exchange, I thought during the live show that maybe we can win very simply by doing this simple tactic of taking and taking on g4, obviously with the intention of giving mate. But this runs into rook f1 check, and white actually loses, so it's not a great idea. But instead of that, white can simply play something like king a1, sidestepping all the possible checks. And then white will just calmly collect the entire house, because black is completely discoordinated and will never get coordinated in this game. Which is why Shah played a rook d1, queen c8. A very beautiful geometric solution exists after queen c6. White can just take on g4 here. I think this is a very aesthetically pleasing move, intending to give this very nice mate. Which is why the queen has to go to c8 here. And here Ding shows the last difficult sequence of the game, queen h4, creating the threat of picking up the queen. Black can take on b3 here, and the game will sort of continue after rook f8 because there are no checks to the black king, and also rook f1 is a threat. But after something like queen d3, bishop e6, and for instance king c1, sidestepping bishop f5 counterplay, the moment the queen alights on the long diagonal, black's position will start crumbling and will sort of never stop crumbling. So this is very, very bad. And it's understandable that Shah decided not to test Ding's technique in this position and played knight f6 instead, which is a clever move, and it almost saves black actually. The point obviously being that after bishop f6, bishop b3, black wins the bishop back. But Ding had it all calculated. After knight f6, he plays rook d6. Black has to take, and we just take on f6 here. And after some thought, Shakhriyar Mamedyarov just resigned here. Bishop is hanging. If you return it somewhere back to the home base, rook to hg6 just wins on the spot. Obviously, you cannot take. And if the king starts running, it gets chased around, and white here actually chases it all the way to mate. And if you take on f6, queen takes f6, black lacks one more tempo to evacuate the bishop somewhere, then he would trade the queens from f5. But as it is, you can only trade queens by giving this bishop up, and then the resulting endgame is just very, very easily technically winning for white. So after rook takes f6, black just stopped the clock and resigned. This is a very, very nice victory by Ding Liren, and somewhat relevantly, he is the first person in the tournament who gets to a +2 score in the classical. And I will show you the results of the rounds now, because it is time to lift the veil from the other games of the day. This is the current standings. As you can see, Magnus won yet another Armageddon quite comfortably on the black side against Wesley So. As I mentioned, they played the same very, very sharp Grunfeld, but Magnus went for a different line. And Wesley, in a position which was still quite unclear, just had a bit of a brain melt and could never really recover. After that, the position just became untenable. Levon Aronian played yet another exciting Armageddon today. He played against Yu Yang-gi, and he finally defeated Yu Yang-gi in an Armageddon. Prior to that moment, Yu Yang-gi was very much in control and won every single Armageddon he played. Alexander Grishuk lost an Armageddon to MVL after having a very decent position, I felt, out of the opening. And probably the most exciting match, apart from the fantastic game that Ding Liren won against Shah, was played by Caruana with white against Vichy. Fabi played a fantastic game in the classical, and then suddenly, when at least one move was more or less winning on the spot after a very, very thrilling attacking game, he started going wrong. He was very, very short on time at that point, but still he found very difficult solutions up to that point, and it was very strange to see him start missing things. he would normally see in his sleep. And he came close to actually even losing the classical game, which we thought made him a reasonably serious underdog in the Armageddon. And then he just proceeded to win the Armageddon game with great ease and great style. So the standings are as you see them. Alexander Grishuk is having the worst tournament of his, arguably maybe entire career, but definitely the worst tournament of in any kind of recent memory. Mamedyarov is also not enjoying himself a great deal. Neither are really MVL and Vichy, and at the top, Levon Aronian is now ahead of Yuan Gi after beating him in their Armageddon match. And Magnus still leads, of course, and in fourth place you see Liren, who actually won 2 classical games, but whose Armageddon results are dragging him very seriously down. So that's the standing with 2 rounds to go. Magnus remains, of course, a very, very large favorite to emerge victorious. He still has to play Fabi. He still has to play Yuan Gi, who has been doing quite well in this tournament. So Magnus plays Yuan Gi tomorrow with the white pieces, and then black against Fabi, I assume, in the last round. So a lot to look forward to. I hope to see you with us during the live broadcasts, but for now, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'm signing off. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess24.